others to join, and then we'll proceed with introductions and to Philippe's presentation. Good morning or afternoon or evening, depending on where you're joining us from. My name is Dan Harsh. I'm the Director of Communications here at the Ash Center for Democratic Governance and Innovation at Harvard Kennedy School. Today's discussion is being hosted by the Ash Center and is being co-sponsored by the Mossavar-Rahmani Center for Business and Government at HKS. Before we start with introductions in today's presentations, I wanted to proceed with a few quick announcements, first on behalf of the Ash Center. The Ash Center would like to acknowledge the land on which Harvard sits as the traditional territory of the Massachusetts people and a place which has long served as a site of meeting and exchange among other nations. Today's event is being recorded, and the video will be made publicly available on the Ash Center's YouTube channel. You're welcome to submit questions anytime throughout the duration of the event. We will have a brief Q&A session following Philippe's presentation. Please send your questions via the Q&A button at the bottom of your screen instead of submitting them via chat. That way, we'll be able to monitor the Q&A function and collect your questions and pose them to Philippe at the conclusion of his presentation. Finally, I'd like to introduce Philippe Le Corre, the featured speaker for today's discussion. Philippe has been a research fellow with the Center for Business and Government and the Ash Center here at HKS since 2017, focusing on China-Europe relations, Chinese overseas investments, and China's global rise. He's an associate in research with the John Fairbanks Center for Chinese Studies and a non-resident senior fellow with Asia and Europe programs at the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace. He was previously a special assistant for international affairs to the French Defense Ministry. He's a co-author of several books, including China's Offensive in Europe, and has participated in the upcoming China Questions too. He's also a co-author of China's Influence in Southeastern, Central, and Eastern Europe, Vulnerabilities and Resilience in Four Countries, a recent report by the Carnegie Endowment published in October of last year. In fact, I think we'll throw the link to that recent report in the text here, as that will serve as the basis for much of Philippe's presentation. And with that, let me hand this over to Philippe. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Dan. I'm glad to be here. And this is obviously a very special day, not just because I'm presenting this work and this report, but also in the sort of international context, which, in Europe, people have been very worried about, but this is not the prime subject of this topic, of this report, and of this conversation. I will try to stick to half an hour and mainly speak about this report that Dan just mentioned on Chinese influence in southeastern, Eastern and Central Europe that came out last year by the Carnegie Endowment, and that was co-authored by three people: Eric Bradberg, Paul Stronsky, and Tom Duval. And obviously, I'll be happy to take questions at the end of this presentation. But let me share my screen first, and then we'll get started. So my talk is titled China Influence as a Global Power, Impact on Vulnerable States. But in fact, this was part of a project that included several regions. And this particular part will be, as the title of the report you can see now indicates, will be focused on Southern and Eastern Europe. The idea for me today is to first look at the concept of vulnerable states and how Chinese influence interacts with these states. And we'll look at three aspects of this, the dimensions of the Chinese influence, the tools and tactics, the goals and objectives. These are the three aspects of this influence. And then, we'll look at case studies, and the report includes 4 case studies, but I will only focus on 3 today. And by the way, I recommend everyone to read the report, which I believe the Ash Center just put on the chat. And also you can look at the other report, which is focused on South Asia, which is on the Carnegie website. And thirdly, I'll look at, we'll have a few policy recommendations that the paper gives at the end of this long study. And finally, I will add a few comments on the current state of EU-China relations, because I believe this is very much part of the story. This is again a very long-term subject, because Chinese presence in Europe has not been that long, and China tends to look at the big picture and the long term. Let me start, and first let's look at the vulnerable states of Europe. Now, obviously, I'm not saying that every state in Europe is vulnerable, which is why I've picked these 3 countries, again, Greece, Hungary, and Romania. And first, let me define what a vulnerable state is, and how. Yes.
I hate to interrupt. I just want to make sure that you had intended to start sharing your screen, because I understand that you do have a presentation. It's you'll have to
okay. I'm sorry.
Reshare as we start into this.
Okay. Yes. I apologize. Yes. Sorry. So. Can you see it now?
Excellent. I think it shows up. It certainly shows up on my screen. It should for all of our participants.
So let me start again briefly. So this is basically the cover of the report, and then I'll look again. I will look at these 3 aspects: the definition of vulnerable states, why Europe, and these 3 case studies I was referring to: Greece, Hungary, and Romania. And thirdly, policy recommendations and the implications for EU-China relations. So first, let us look at the vulnerable states definition. It can be defined as countries where the gap is greater between the scope and intensity of Chinese activism. Secondly, countries where local capacity to manage or mitigate political and economic risks is impeded. For example, weak state institutions, fragile civil societies, and what we call elite capture, or close to be captured, if you want, capture-able, let's put it this way. Thirdly, countries where elites have a poor understanding about tools and tactics of China. That could be another power, by the way, and I know that many have Ukraine and the Ukraine situation on your mind, but we can come to that in the Q&A session, as the 2 situations are vastly different. And lastly, the policy of each country. Is it adapted to local realities or to the domestic political and economic truth? Vulnerability is particularly notable in Southeastern Europe, Central Europe, Eastern Europe, South Asia, as I said at the beginning of my remarks. And that is why this research involved all these regions and what we call pivot countries. And the 3 goals in assessing the vulnerabilities were enhancing local awareness of Chinese activism, sharing experiences of best practice, and develop policy prescriptions. Now, let's look at the metrics to measure Chinese influence. Chinese influence can be measured empirically along 3 dimensions. First, dimensions of Chinese influence in vulnerable states. Let's say Chinese activities that shape or constrain choices for local political or economic elites, Chinese activities that influence or constrain parameters of local public opinion, and China's impact on local civil society and academia. What are the goals and objectives of China? Push exports, economic power, exert political influence in some cases, and foster a positive image of China. And the final part, what are the tools of Chinese influence? Trade, obviously, manufacturing, we'll come to that in a moment, foreign exchange, capital, that's foreign direct investment, broad-reaching public relations outreach, that would be under the category of soft power, funding, united front tactics, some of you may be familiar with this definition, and then more generally cultivating friendly voices, in these countries and soft power influence. So the question is whether these are successful and whether it had success in improving China's image in these countries. Now, of course, why do we pick Europe? Because obviously Europe has a lot of countries, some of them part of the European Union, some not. And the 3 countries I'm focusing on today are all part of the EU: Greece, Hungary, and Romania. As you know, Europe has been an entry point for the Belt and Road Initiative and was perhaps originally the prime target of the BRI, which was launched by President Xi Jinping in 2013. This is obviously part of a massive effort by China to engage economically with the rest of the world and to help Chinese companies to outreach and to expand. In some cases, Europe has had a favorable regulatory and economic conditions, and sometimes the weak local institutions have helped China to establish a footprint. There are a number of common characteristics of these 3 countries. One of them is to get economic involvement from China, FDI, all kinds of economic help. But the question that we ask is, how can countries manage their vulnerabilities and build resilience in their interactions with China? This is an analytical question. There's nothing ideological here, dare I say, but the question is, where do we go from now after 10 years of Chinese involvement in these countries and in the rest of Europe? So first, let us look at Greece. Now, Greece is obviously a very well-known case. It has 2 major Chinese investments. One of them is very well-known, the Piraeus Harbor, which is Athens' main harbor, where COSCO, China shipping company, top shipping company, and of course a state-owned company, has become the prime shareholder of the Piraeus Port Authority. Last year, COSCO took over an additional 16% of the ports, and it now stands at 67% of the whole port authority. It does have a second involvement in another harbor, the Thessaloniki harbor, but it's not a majority share. But it shows that obviously Greece is an important platform for Chinese shipping activities and port activities. And in fact, one of the reasons that Piraeus in particular has been a successful investment by China is that China has shifted some of the traffic from other ports to Piraeus, and it made it one of the top ports in Europe. What can we say? What else can we say about Greece and China? Well, it's been defined by Xi Jinping himself as the dragon's head of the maritime Silk Road. The maritime Silk Road obviously is part of the Belt and Road Initiative. The other part being, across Central Asia, and it's mainly, in the northern parts, while the maritime route has been defined as this new engagement with many countries that come from China, from the China Sea all the way to Europe. There is also the positive narrative towards Greece that the Chinese media have been relaying and conveying for many years. In fact, you hardly read any criticism of Greece in the Chinese media. In fact, there's one narrative that is often repeated, and that started, in fact, during the 2008 Olympics. As you may recall, Athens, which is the birthplace of Olympics in general, hosted modern Olympics in 2004. And the next city to host Summer Olympics was Beijing, which just had the Winter Olympics. So these connections helped to foster a strong collaboration, dare I say, between the two countries. And in fact, the Chinese narrative on Greece has always been that we are two ancient civilizations, and therefore that brings together our people. Now, as we'll see, it's not always perceived in the same way in Greece as it is in China, which is why I'm saying there is a shift in Greek perception of China. And in many cases, in fact, you can read in the Greece chapter of my report that the public opinion has shifted from 2019 to 2020, with almost a majority of Greek people, in fact, blaming China for COVID-19, for the origins of COVID-19, which of course was a bit surprising, considering that the Greek public opinion is usually the most favorable to China in Europe. Now, I'll just say a word about the Piraeus deal, because in fact, it has been a successful investment, as I said earlier, but it was also a very controversial deal, particularly the last part of the deal, which I was referring to. Last summer, before the Greek government agreed to finalize the last portion, there were lots of complaints and conflicts, local conflicts, people criticizing COSCO for not delivering. So there is an increasing skepticism in local shareholders about COSCO. I'll go very quickly. I've already mentioned the ancient civilization narrative. There are many Greece-China associations, and the BRI, and didn't mention the 17+1, but we'll come back to this. And again, on the trade figures, you can see that Greek imports from China are increasing, but Greek exports to China are increasing too, which is not the case for many other countries. Now, of course, you can't compare the levels, but it is an interesting fact to notice. For example, export destinations, China would be 3% for the size of an economy like Greece's. This is not insignificant. Second case study, Hungary. Now, Hungary can be described as the outlier in the EU because it embraced close relations with China in the early 2000s. In fact, Prime Minister Viktor Orban, who is still the Prime Minister and who's running for election on April the 2nd or April the 4th, if I remember, very, very soon. He's really the man who's responsible for this closer relationship with China. So you can say that Budapest, the capital of Hungary, has been, you know, a sort of welcoming city for Chinese business people, in particular in Europe, from the very beginning, before, say, Germany, the UK, or France, which, by the way, happen to be the three largest recipient countries of Chinese direct investments. So the vulnerability of Hungary, of course, is questionable in the sense that the government obviously welcomed Chinese presence in Hungary, and especially as an alternative to the liberal West. And you can say that Orban, who's been in power for a long time now, encouraged Chinese involvement. But what we'll see, and again, the trade figures are easily accessible online in the report, and I won't go too much into details. What's interesting is to look at the public opinions and the fact there's been many debates about Chinese presence in Hungary, particularly around the project of a new campus in Budapest, which would be a subsidiary of Fudan University in Shanghai. And that may be of interest to a lot of our audience, but it's far from being a done deal. There have been much criticism, and in fact, it's even been discussed in Parliament, in Hungarian Parliament, and also in the media and within academia and civil society. A lot of people are skeptical about many of the Chinese projects in Hungary that have been promoted by Viktor Orban. Another project that's been very controversial is the Budapest to Belgrade high-speed railway, which is a very slow start, and that has been controversial because not much has been happening really. It's and particularly Hungary, being a member of the European Union, didn't comply with certain competition rules at the beginning and had to go under the table eventually to allow this deal to happen without much competition. So it is now going on, but very slowly and not without criticism. In terms of soft power, of course, there is a Chinese presence, many media partnerships, and there's a think tank that is the only Chinese think tank based in Europe, I believe. There are 5 Confucius Institutes and many links with Hungarian universities, but this is all fairly soft, and there is no huge industrial investment, if you will. So the key takeaway is that China is an important economic and trade partner, but in terms of Hungary's positioning as a member of the European Union, it is a little bit awkward because Hungary relies a lot on EU funding and has supported most EU decisions, including on China. So to conclude on this case study, Hungary is an outlier, but at the same time, things might change in April if Mr. Orban is no longer the prime minister, and it's seen very much as tied to his government. I'll go very quickly on the third case, because in a way, Romania, which is, my Romanian friends used to tell me that they would, when they travel to Beijing, not so long ago, they would be welcomed as lao pengyo, old friends, due to the past, due to the fact former dictator Ceausescu was extremely close to the Chinese leadership. And in China, Romania has always been seen as a close partner. The reality is otherwise. Of course, Romania was an active member of the 17+1 format. This is a group of countries that Beijing set up 10 years ago. The 17 are either members of the EU or members of the West Balkans. That means it's a kind of an odd group. And in fact, Lithuania, one of the 17 just decided to leave the 17+1 last year, which we can come back to this in the Q&A. But Greece joined the 17+1 in 2019. So we went from 16 to 17 to now 16 again. And honestly, there's been a lot of disappointment as well on the 17+1, including in Romania, which was expecting much more deliverables from China in terms of investments. And for some reason, of course, the Sino-Romanian trade has increased a lot. But other economic cooperation projects, including in the nuclear industry and infrastructures in particular, have not taken place. And of course, it's a very changeable political environment. China doesn't like, the shifts in the domestic political systems. But all these countries, I was mentioning Hungary earlier, but Romania had many prime ministers for the past 30 years. And this means that there have been many political shifts and pro-Chinese parties can be replaced in elections. And that means some of the deals that were agreed for in the end did not take place. I would add that the Romanian government is also a NATO member, and by the way, Greece and Hungary are NATO members as well, and NATO has been very much in the news for the past few days on the Ukraine-Russia dramatic situation now taking place. And that means that there are NATO troops in Romania, and Romania has committed to a close partnership with the United States, with the EU, and with NATO. And that of course has been an impediment to China's presence in Romania. Now let me turn, and I'm reaching the last part of my presentation. Let me turn to our paper's policy recommendations, and basically, if we can go back to the original idea, there were three motivating objectives of China: pushing exports and investments, and enhancing Chinese economic footprint in Europe through the Belt and Road Initiative, but other campaigns and as well, and strategies, exerting political influence in Europe, and that would of course be a way to expand China as a major power, and thirdly, fostering a positive image of China and relations with China. Now, of course, this was, by the way, this work was conducted during the year 2020 and the year 2021, which means that, of course, we were in the middle of the COVID pandemic, and public opinions were indeed affected by the pandemic, and China, as you know, there were a number of actions. Some people called it the wolf war diplomacy actions, and means used in the media to promote the Chinese narrative that were not necessarily well received in many of these countries, nor were they well received in the western part of Europe. So in terms of positive image, I don't think this is the priority of China for the time being. But that doesn't mean China wants to withdraw from Europe. I very much think that the opposite, and on the long run. And now we can come back to that in a moment. The second aspect was leveraging local vulnerabilities, and whether it's managed to take advantage of weak state institutions. Well, that probably would be the case for Hungary, and as the Hungarian establishment under Viktor Orban's party was very keen to develop this partnership with China. But at the same time, there are points of European resilience. What one could say that there were misplaced expectations of trade and investment on the part of China. They've been bottom-up pushback against Chinese deals, and generally there's a deep-rooted orientation on the West in many of these countries that are all members of the EU and of NATO. And fourthly, the limited effectiveness of soft power efforts on the part of China. But this has also been part of this context of COVID-19 and somewhat use of propaganda, which was less so, I must say, in these three countries than in Western countries such as Italy, France, Germany. In terms of recommendations of the paper, I'll just go through them, and I've cut down the list, to be honest, because it's a long list that you will find in the very last part of our reports. But I would say, do not overplay Chinese economic influence. Understand local interests. These are recommendations for, by the way, institutions and governments, both in the EU, in the US, and of course some of these nations. I would say avoid assigning strategic significance to all of China's actions. I tend to say in all my lectures that Chinese involvement is a mix of opportunism and strategy. Well, of course, we are focusing more on the strategy these days, but China is also well known for its opportunistic move, both in political and economic terms. And then, generally, I would say that the West and Europe in particular, I'm thinking of the EU, and I'll come to that shortly, should put forward its attractiveness, the attractiveness of its economy, its market. After all, the European Union market is it's a 420 million consumer market, and fairly attractive to other players, and our values is also something which should be put forward. Now, finally, let me say a word on more broadly on the EU-China relations. Since 2019, of course, there have been many changes. Some of you may have heard of the triptych. That is the new definition that Brussels, where the European Commission is based, is explaining its relationship with China. China to the EU is a partner, an economic competitor, and a systemic rival. Now, none of the 27 countries, that includes the 3 case studies I've referred to today, has opposed this definition, this triptych. Nor have they opposed a number of mechanisms, I would say defensive mechanisms, that the European Union has produced over the past 2.5 years, including a screening of foreign direct investment mechanism, including a toolbox on 5G and technology, including anti-coercion instruments, and an upcoming regulation on state subsidies. On the other hand, you could argue that Hungary particularly blocked a couple of EU resolutions on human rights and on condemning China's action on Hong Kong, for example. So you could argue that in some cases, China has succeeded in influencing the EU. As you know, the unanimity rule is the one that the European Union is using, which makes it very difficult for the 27 to come together on issues of that importance. I would also say a word about the Comprehensive Agreement on Investment, the famous CAI, which was announced by Chancellor Angela Merkel while she was president of the European Council at the very end of 2020. And that comprehensive agreement between the EU and China was to allow a better level playing field and market access to European companies in China. Now, this deal is now frozen due to sanctions that have been imposed first by the EU on 4 Chinese Communist Party officials over the situation in Xinjiang against the Uyghur minority, and then China imposed also sanctions not shortly after against a very long list of people, including members of the European Parliament, the very ones that are supposed to ratify the CAI. So that obviously didn't work out, and this deal is now completely frozen and will remain so at least until the next elections of the European Parliament, which will be in 2.5 years. Xinjiang remains a major obstacle to the improvement of relations between China and the EU, as is the International Labour Organization Convention that China is supposed to ratify, or at least agreed in principle to ratify, but that hasn't happened yet. And obviously, you can see the connection with Xinjiang as well. European public opinion, which was in general fairly favorable to China until 2019, has shifted for a number of reasons. You can read the various polls by Pew Research or by Kantar, another pollster. In fact, obviously the emergence of China as a major power and as an authoritarian state has contributed to this shift. But some of the increased presence of China in these countries has also contributed, and perhaps somewhat the COVID-19 pandemic, and as well as the additional factors I was referring to earlier, including the media use of Chinese aid, the instrumentalization of Chinese aid, the mask diplomacy and things like that. That has somewhat backfired. Finally, I'm afraid time for separating political and economic ties between China and the EU is over. China often criticizes the West for politicizing the relationships, the foreign relations, but in fact, China is also very, very political itself, and therefore, as we saw from the situation around the CAI, everything is political, and when sanctions are being imposed on members of the European Parliament, surely, or when indeed the European Parliament criticizes China on issues such as Hong Kong, Xinjiang, not to mention risks over Taiwan. This is obviously a complicated situation. Meanwhile, the market access in China is considered by many foreign companies as insufficient. The Chinese market remains difficult, and of course, the fact that many expatriates have had to leave and generally have not been able to work in China for the past 2 years have made things even more complicated. So the systemic rivalry, which is the third part of the triptych, is now dominant in the relationship. Not as dominant, perhaps, as with the United States and between the United States and China, as we speak more about systemic or strategic competition, but indeed the mood is now different. So a lot will depend on the large countries of the EU, and France is actually now chairing. Holding the rotating presidency of the EU. You can imagine how busy the French government must be now with this war in Ukraine that just started. But of course, a lot will also depend on Germany, which is Europe's economic powerhouse. So I'll leave it there, and I now look forward to your questions.
Philippe, thank you so much for a really interesting presentation. And for those who would like to learn more, I would really recommend that you read the fuller report that Philippe drafted with the Carnegie Endowment. And I believe the link to that report is in the chat here, and we can also turn off the screen sharing. Excellent, thank you. And so it's about 10:13 here, so we have about 15 minutes or so for audience Q&A. We have a number of questions that were submitted ahead of time that we will try to get to. In addition, if you have a question, please use the Q&A box at the bottom of your screen to submit that. Please don't use the chat box because we'll be monitoring the Q&A box. And I will start off with a few questions from our audience. And I would also like to preface this that I know that many of us are really thinking about what's happening in Ukraine. It's a little bit outside the scope of the conversation tonight. And I didn't want to put Philippe on the spot to sort of be a kind of prognosticating about what's going to happen there, because it's really not about the talk that he has, that he's presented to us today. So maybe we could try to hold on some of those questions. If we have a little bit of time at the end, if we've gotten through all the other questions, we may have time to address some of those. But I want to get into some of the issues that are really specific to his presentation today. I'm going to start with the first question. Actually, it's about corruption, and it dovetails nicely with the question I had sort of asked myself too in the presentation. And this is Tim from the United Kingdom, and he's asking, what part does the prevalence of corruption in European countries play in Chinese influence seeking? And I think that plays, Philippe, with your question, with the statement that you said about sort of democratic institutions, and maybe we can even broaden that up to the prevalence of strong democratic institutions in civil society.
So Dan, well, of course, corruption is not limited to undemocratic countries, and there are, in fact, a number of situations. I can't sort of get Ukraine and Russia out of my mind at the same time. As we know, many former Soviet republics in particular, and I don't want to name any in particular, but have had oligarchs and have conducted business in a certain way, and that has allowed non-democratic countries to step in and to engage in activities in these countries. Having said that, and if I can mention another state which is not part of my case studies, there have been also defensive mechanisms. If you think of the Czech Republic, for example, where the current president, President Miloš Zeman, was seen as very close to Russia and China, and a number of other politicians had a lot of deals or encourage a lot of deals with both Russia and China. This was very much criticized by the public opinion, by experts, media, other politicians. And in the end, there's one particular Chinese company I have in mind called CFC, which got involved in many real estate deals that has eventually to withdrew from China and to sell some of its activities. Meanwhile, in Hungary, again, if Prime Minister Orban was to relinquish power in a few weeks, I wouldn't be surprised if some of the deals that took place over the past 10 or 15 years would unfold not in a favorable way to his party and to his entourage, so to speak. So there is indeed corruption, and certainly the three countries are not immune to it, nor are others in the region. But bear in mind that these countries are part of the EU, and the EU has certain rules to be respected. Therefore, for example, I was mentioning the high-speed railway deal between Budapest and Belgrade. Belgrade, by the way, being the capital of Serbia, which is a non-EU member. To launch a project of this size, which involves two countries, you do need approval from the regulator in Brussels. And that's what Viktor Orban failed to do originally. And obviously, by granting the deal to a Chinese company, he had to put a freeze on it for a number of years because he didn't comply with certain regulations. And Brussels threatened, the Hungarian government with retaliation, if not sanctions. And as I said, I mean, Hungary is a full member of the EU, has to comply with the rules, and certainly needs to, if it wants the funds coming through from Brussels, it needs to comply and to make sure it follows the rules of the EU.
Excellent, thank you. And our next question is about Germany, and whether you could speak to how German-Chinese relations are shifting, and I would also have append that with, I mean, what is Chancellor Scholz's China policy? I mean, it wasn't something that was really discussed during the campaign, and I think a lot of observers are wondering whether or not he's going to diverge significantly from his predecessor in that respect.
So it's still an ongoing process, I would say. As you know, the Germany is run by coalition, which is different from the previous coalition under Chancellor Merkel. The coalition has three parties: the SPD, the Social Democrats, the Free Democrats, the Liberals, rather, and the Greens. And they have different views, but to build a coalition, the Germans have a very good way to organize things. They gather for a few days and put together what they call a treaty, a coalition treaty. That treaty, actually, the one that was approved late last year following the parliamentary elections, has a few mentions of relations with China. Now, this indeed, it's a very good question you ask, as Germany is not only Europe's economic powerhouse, but also the prime economic partner of China in Europe. Many industrial companies, German industrial companies, have indeed invested in China. The trade between China and Germany is very balanced. For the German business sector to abandon the Chinese market it's not feasible. It's just not feasible considering the level of investment and considerable the size of the Chinese market. So for the new chancellor and his coalition, and he may not actually have the same views as his foreign minister, who comes from the Green Party, it's a complicated one, as the restrictions to the Chinese markets I mentioned earlier remain in place, and the level playing field is just not there. At the same time, many German companies, which have a long established presence in China, particularly in the car industry, but also chemicals, for example, they are obviously benefiting from this market. That is not the case for a number of high-tech companies that were, on the contrary, acquired by Chinese state-owned companies. I'm thinking of the company KUKA, which is a top robotics company that was acquired in 2016, which was very much a turning point when the Confederation of German Industries actually recommended the German government to be much more cautious and to call for a more balanced relationship with China. So you could say that even though Chancellor Merkel, before she left, pushed hard for this comprehensive agreement on investment, which would have allowed a more balanced relationship, there were a lot of criticisms around this deal. One reason why was that it took place just a few weeks before the new U.S. administration was in office. So President Biden and his team were not particularly happy about that, and then it also ended in fairly badly so far because of the mixed sanctions I was mentioning, and it looks like it's not going to be finalized anytime soon, as members of the European Parliament particularly were sanctioned or blacklisted by China over the past few months.
Excellent. I want to keep this string going actually on the EU and shift over to a question that was submitted during the registration process here. And kind of curious, how effective has the EU been in setting and enforcing a bloc-wide policy towards China, and frankly, how successful has China been in trying to pierce that EU-wide policy and kind of chip off individual states to sort of convince them to kind of pursue their own national interests ahead of those of the EU's?
Well, I think, in the past 3 years, there's been a major change in the EU's policy towards China. In fact, Angela Merkel herself, just before she left office, said that Europeans had been somewhat naive over many years of dealing with China. It can't just be dealing on the trade and investment basis. First of all, these aspects have to be reciprocal, that's for sure. And for many years, we've let Chinese state-backed companies coming into Europe with state subsidies and Chinese banks helping, which was fairly, completely unfair in free market economies. And secondly, we have to, as Europeans, we have to put forward, European values, which we share with other countries around the world, including the United States, but also Asian countries and Canada, Australia, and many others. And this is something that the EU should not compromise on. I think there's an agreement among the 27 members that China is a systemic rival because its system it doesn't call for the same values and principles, and the European principles are very well known. Now, obviously, if I can say a few words about Ukraine, because I'm sure people are interested, and in Europe, it's in everybody's mind at the moment. Obviously, the invasion of Ukraine by Russia is an attack to Europeans' values, and Ukraine is not a member of the EU, but it happens to be a close neighbor of the EU, and obviously it aspired to be a democratic state, and it has no. It had no ambition of being aggressive. It was not particularly aggressive towards anyone. So again, there's no way the Europeans can be against a country that would basically favor democracy and freedom of expression.
Thank you. Actually, I'm glad that you raised the issue of Ukraine, because I wanted to bring up another country that borders Russia, and that's Lithuania, which has obviously been in the news of late because of the extraordinary tensions between Lithuania and China. And we have a question here that was submitted earlier about vulnerable states and how they view China's response to Lithuania, and whether or not that is going to severely undermine Chinese standing in Europe. And also, Philippe, I would ask, maybe before we unpack that pretty big question, if you could perhaps give the audience just a brief background on sort of the tensions between the two countries, because it is really quite remarkable what's happening there.
Sure. Well, what happened is that last year, Lithuania, which is a small country of 3 million people, one of the 3 Baltic states, very close to Russia, by the way, and as you can imagine, in the current situation, I'm sure people in Lithuania are incredibly worried about their own future. Lithuania decided to allow Taiwan to open an office in Vilnius, and letting it being opened as under the name of Taiwanese office to Lithuania, and at the same time opened a Lithuanian office in Taiwan. Now, this led to an extremely angry reaction from China, because obviously for the past few years, countries that have opened offices in Taiwan call them Taipei rather than Taiwan. This has led to a range of sanctions and against Lithuanian companies, against companies that have manufacturing in Lithuania, and that was not actually officially announced by China, but they've been, basically Lithuania is blacklisted in China. Anything that's coming from Lithuania is banned in China. And that's really a warning from China to other countries that may try to do similar things. Having said that, Taiwan is de facto an independent country, and there is no, calling it Taiwan or Taipei doesn't make such a big difference. Now, it's possible that Lithuania went a little bit far by calling it this way, and in fact, I believe Slovenia also opened an office in Taiwan and eventually called it Taipei after being warned by China. But Europe has to be very careful in dealing with these issues, because it shouldn't basically change its way of doing things just because it's been lectured by a power, whether it's China or another power. So I think it's we're in a critical situation here, and I think the EU is behind Lithuania, and in fact has launched a case in the WTO with China, but it will take a long time, and meanwhile Lithuanian companies are being hurt.
But do you think that the very aggressive response from Beijing over the opening of a tech row office, and to be clear, the United States and most Western countries have a tech row, a sort of unofficial embassy presence in Beijing. We have in Taiwan, and I should say, in Taiwan has its offices in Western capitals. The U.S. has the American Institute in Taiwan, which essentially functions as a de facto U.S. embassy there. But do you think the incredibly heavy-handed response from Beijing is really undermining China's strategy in Europe and giving countries pause because of just the severity of the response? Or do you think that countries are going to be cowed by this and really give a second thought as to losing trade access to China?
So as I said, I mean, the situation is not very smooth between Europe and China, even though compared to the US-China relationship, you could argue that it's slightly better, or that it appears better, particularly in the, if you read the Chinese narrative, which has very much been about reaching out to Europe, not just because it's a market, but also because it's an alternative to the United States. But I agree with you. I mean, Lithuania is a small country, harmless. By the way, it's not the first time that happened. Norway, as you may recall, was punished, and Norwegian salmon was banned for many years in China, just because the Nobel Peace Prize was awarded to a Chinese dissident by the Nobel Peace Prize Committee, which is an independent organization based in Oslo, Norway. So I think the response by the EU is very critical, and it shows that China is basically in an uncompromising mood, and in fact, the reaction by the Chinese Foreign Ministry with regard to Ukraine's invasion by Russian forces appears to go in that direction as well, as the minister says he understands Russia's legitimate concerns on security. And I think democracies have to band together and to stand for their values, and when their members of the European Union in particular are being punished, they should certainly stick together.
And I know that we are over our allotted hour, and I think maybe there's so many questions that have been submitted, and they're fantastic questions. I was wondering, perhaps we can have one final question, and then and call and wrap it after that. Does that sound good? Can you give us a few
Fine.
extra minutes?
Yes.
It's just you've got to give the people what they want.
Exactly.
Let's talk a little bit about Ukraine, because we have a number of questions that have come in about that, but I want to sort of focus it more on the topic of your conversation. And we've seen a shift in Beijing's attitudes towards sort of Russian aggression vis-a-vis Ukraine since 2014, when Russia unilaterally annexed the Crimean Peninsula, and Beijing criticized that. But here you see the acquiescence to what seems to be a full-throated invasion of Ukraine that's unfolding right now. Why are we seeing that shift? And what does that say about China's future relationships with Europe, given the nearly unified European opposition and abhorrence to what's happening right now?
Well, in the year of the upcoming 20th Congress of the Chinese Communist Party, I suppose domestic politics are what matter. And you may recall that on February 4th, Vladimir Putin was in Beijing meeting President Xi Jinping. who had not met any foreign leader for 2 years, and that spoke volume in itself. The statements that was published on February 4th that basically said that the Russia-China partnership had no limits, and that both of the countries were criticizing what they called the Cold War mentality, and that it should be abandoned. So in many ways, there should not be a Cold War, in the sense that there was a Cold War before that was eventually won by the West. And, China is trying to balance its long-time commitment of non-interference, perhaps, with other countries. You may recall that for the past few decades, the Chinese leadership has been repeating that, as a country, you should not just invade, but interfere with another country. Now, as I hope I've managed to explain between the lines in the past 65 minutes, I think it does interfere in some ways within democracies, but in a different way, in a more subtle way, perhaps, than Russia, and certainly a very different way from the way that Russia has been dealing very, very sadly with Ukraine. The other thing that it's going to deal with is its economic interests, and obviously having a global war or a war in Europe is not going to help China's interests. But at the same time, the Russia-China partnership is very important at many levels, against the West, I suppose, and also think of Taiwan. If China was to attack Taiwan at some point, it would need the support of the Russian leadership, and it looks like it would get it. So that explains, at least to my mind, the relative support of the Chinese government with regard to Russia's war in Ukraine and invasion of Ukraine.
Excellent. Philippe, thank you so much for joining us. It's been an excellent conversation. And for those that want to learn more, I would really encourage you to look at the Carnegie report that Philippe authored earlier last year. And thanks so much for joining us. And if you care, the full recording will be on the Ash Center's YouTube page, should you want to go back and review this morning's conversation. Thanks so much.